Carl Jung uncovered something that will shake you to your core. Empaths don't just feel more deeply than others. They carry what he called the wound of rare souls, a psychological burden so profound that it marks them from birth and follows them through every relationship, every interaction, every moment of their existence. This isn't about being sensitive or having feelings. This is about carrying a mark that makes you fundamentally different from most humans walking this earth. Jung spent decades documenting this phenomenon in his clinical practice, and what he discovered was both beautiful and devastating. Empaths are born with what he termed heightened psychic permeability, the ability to absorb psychological contents from everyone around them. But this gift comes with a price that most people cannot comprehend. Today I'm revealing Jung's most profound insights about why empaths carry wounds that others will never understand, and more importantly, why this wound is actually their greatest power waiting to be claimed. Because here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. The empath's wound isn't a defect in their psychological makeup. It's an evolutionary advancement that society hasn't learned to recognize or value. And that lack of recognition creates a specific kind of suffering that only empaths experience. Jung wrote extensively about what he called psychological types, and within his framework, he identified individuals who possessed what he termed differentiated feeling function combined with introverted intuition. These people, empaths in modern language, don't just observe emotions in others, they experience them as if those emotions were their own. Jung documented case after case of patients who came to him exhausted, depleted, and convinced something was fundamentally wrong with them. They described feeling everyone's pain, absorbing everyone's stress, carrying burdens that didn't belong to them but felt as real as their own heartbeat. Jung realized these weren't damaged people. They were what he called psychologically porous individuals whose boundaries between self and other were naturally thinner than the rest of humanity. This porousness, Jung discovered, wasn't pathology. It was a different kind of consciousness altogether. But society, built by and for people with normal psychological boundaries, treats this porousness as weakness, as something to be fixed or overcome. And that's where the wound begins. The wound of rare souls starts in childhood. Jung observed that empathic children sense their parents' unspoken emotions, their hidden resentments, their secret despairs. While other children play innocently, the empathic child becomes what Jung called the family's unconscious therapist, absorbing and processing emotions that adults cannot handle themselves. Jung wrote that these children develop what he termed premature psychological awareness. They understand dynamics that should be beyond their developmental capacity. They feel tensions that others don't notice. They become hyper-vigilant to emotional atmospheres because their survival depends on reading the psychological weather of every room they enter. This creates what Jung identified as the first layer of the wound. The empathic child learns that their own emotions are less important than managing everyone else's emotional state. They become what I call emotional shock absorbers, individuals whose primary function becomes stabilizing the psychological systems around them. Jung documented how this pattern becomes deeply ingrained. The empathic child who comforts their depressed mother, who mediates their parents' unspoken conflicts, who sacrifices their own needs to keep peace in the household, learns a devastating lesson. Their value comes from their usefulness to others, not from their inherent worth as individuals. This is the original wound, and it shapes everything that follows. As empaths grow into adolescence and adulthood, Jung observed that the wound deepens through what he called repetition compulsion. They unconsciously recreate dynamics where they give endlessly while receiving minimally. They attract people who need them but cannot reciprocate. They find themselves in relationships, friendships, and work environments where their empathic gifts are exploited rather than honored. Jung realized this wasn't coincidence or bad luck. Empaths were unconsciously drawn to situations that confirmed their childhood programming. If they learned their value came from being needed, they would unconsciously seek out people who needed them while being incapable of genuine mutuality. The wound becomes self-perpetuating. Each relationship that takes more than it gives, each friendship where they listen for hours but never feel heard themselves, each workplace where their emotional labor goes unrecognized and unrewarded, all of these experiences reinforce the original wound. Jung called this the neurotic repetition of unresolved patterns. The empath keeps trying to heal their original wound by giving more, caring more, sacrificing more. hoping that eventually someone will recognize their worth and give back with equal depth. But Jung discovered something crucial. The wound cannot be healed through external validation. It can only be healed through what he called individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole by integrating all aspects of yourself, including the parts you've been taught to deny. For empaths, Jung identified specific aspects of the wound that distinguish them from other psychological struggles. The first aspect is what he termed ontological loneliness. Empaths experience a fundamental isolation that comes from perceiving reality differently than most people. They feel emotional undercurrents that others dismiss or don't notice. They sense psychological truths that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. They exist in what Jung called a different layer of consciousness than the collective. This creates profound loneliness, not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the loneliness of living in a reality that few others can perceive or validate. Jung wrote that empaths often feel like aliens in human society, forever watching others engage in ways of being that feel foreign and impossible to them. They see through social performances that others take at face value. They feel the darkness beneath polite interactions. They cannot participate in collective denial because their heightened perception won't allow it. This ontological loneliness is part of the wound because empaths long for connection but cannot find it through conventional means. Surface-level friendships feel hollow. Small talk feels unbearable. They need depth, authenticity, and psychological honesty in ways that most people find overwhelming or unnecessary. Jung observed that this leaves empaths perpetually on the outside, even when surrounded by people. The second aspect of the empath's wound is what Jung called the burden of unconscious absorption. Empaths don't just feel their own emotions. They unconsciously absorb the denied emotions of everyone around them. Jung documented this phenomenon extensively. He found that empaths often carried rage that belonged to passive-aggressive family members, depression that belonged to emotionally numb partners, anxiety that belonged to stressed colleagues. They became what Jung termed psychological repositories for the collective shadow, all the emotions and experiences that others cannot consciously process. This absorption happens unconsciously and automatically. The empath walks into a room, and their nervous system immediately begins processing the emotional atmosphere. They talk to someone and unconsciously take on that person's unspoken stress. They exist in systems and absorb the dysfunction those systems refuse to acknowledge. Jung realized this created a specific kind of exhaustion that others couldn't understand. People would tell empaths they were too sensitive, that they needed to toughen up, that they were overreacting. But Jung knew the truth. Empaths weren't overreacting to their own emotions. They were being overwhelmed by everyone else's denied emotions that they had unconsciously absorbed without realizing it. The third aspect of the wound is what Jung called the curse of clear seeing. Empaths possess heightened intuition that allows them to see through facades, detect deception, and sense hidden motivations. Jung observed that this ability, while potentially powerful, creates immense suffering because empaths see truths that others deny. They see their friend's relationship is unhealthy long before anyone admits it. They sense their colleagues' manipulation before anyone else notices. They feel family dynamics that everyone pretends don't exist. This clear seeing becomes a curse because when empaths try to name what they see, they're dismissed, gaslit, or attacked. Jung documented case after case where empaths were labeled as negative, dramatic, or creating problems simply because they voiced perceptions that others found threatening. This teaches empaths to doubt their own perceptions, to silence their intuitive knowing, to apologize for seeing what's actually happening. The wound deepens each time they're told their truth is wrong, each time their accurate perceptions are invalidated, each time they're made to feel crazy for seeing clearly. Jung understood that this creates a devastating split within empaths. They know what they perceive is accurate, but everyone around them insists it's not. They learn to distrust their greatest gift, their intuitive perception, because trusting it costs them social acceptance and connection. The fourth aspect Jung identified is what he called the martyr complex trap. Because empaths are natural givers who feel others' pain acutely, they often fall into what Jung termed the wounded healer archetype. Without proper integration, they become addicted to being needed. They define their worth through their usefulness to others. They sacrifice themselves repeatedly while calling it love or compassion. Jung warned that this pattern, while appearing noble on the surface, actually prevents psychological growth. The empath who constantly rescues others never develops their own life. The empath who absorbs everyone's pain never processes their own. The empath who gives endlessly from depletion rather than abundance destroys themselves while believing they're being virtuous. This aspect of the wound is particularly insidious because it disguises itself as goodness. Empaths believe they're being loving, kind, and compassionate when they sacrifice themselves. But Jung recognized this as unconscious self-destruction dressed up as spirituality. True compassion, Jung insisted, includes compassion for yourself. True love includes love for your own being. True service comes from wholeness, not from woundedness seeking validation through usefulness. Jung spent years studying why empaths develop these wounds and what function they serve psychologically. He concluded that the empath's wound serves what he called an initiatory function. In traditional societies, Jung observed, individuals with heightened sensitivity often became shamans, healers, or wisdom keepers. They underwent specific initiations that taught them how to use their gifts without being destroyed by them. Modern society, Jung lamented, has no such initiations. Empaths are born with shamanic sensitivity, but raised in cultures that have no framework for understanding or developing these gifts. They're told they're too sensitive instead of being taught how to use their sensitivity wisely. They're medicated for feeling too much instead of being initiated into conscious relationship with their extraordinary perceptual abilities. The wound, Jung realized, is actually the beginning of a potential initiation that modern culture doesn't know how to complete. Empaths suffer not because they're broken, but because they're exceptional individuals in a society built for average psychological function. Their wound is the price of being born with consciousness that exceeds collective development. But Jung discovered something revolutionary. When empaths understand their wound not as pathology but as initiation, everything changes. The suffering that nearly destroyed them becomes the foundation for extraordinary psychological development. The sensitivity that isolated them becomes the gift that connects them to others at profound depth. The clear seeing that got them labeled as problems becomes wisdom that can guide and heal. This is where Jung's work becomes transformative for empaths. He mapped out what he called the individuation process, a systematic approach to integrating the wounded aspects of self with the powerful aspects, creating what he termed the integrated personality. For empaths, individuation requires what Jung called conscious suffering, not the unconscious suffering of absorbing everyone's pain while calling it compassion, but the conscious suffering of feeling your own pain, processing your own shadow, and taking responsibility for your own psychological development. Jung insisted that empaths must learn to distinguish between their own emotional content and what they've absorbed from others. They must develop what he termed psychological boundaries, not walls that shut others out, but conscious filters that allow connection without contamination. They must integrate their shadow, all the anger, selfishness, and darkness they've been taught to deny. And most importantly, they must learn what Jung called self-love, not narcissistic self-absorption, but genuine appreciation for their own being independent of their usefulness to others. Jung documented specific stages that empaths move through as they heal the wound of rare souls and claim their power. The first stage he called the awakening, the moment when empaths recognize they've been living for others while abandoning themselves. This awakening often comes through crisis, a betrayal so profound it shatters their illusions, a physical collapse from years of depletion, a dark night of the soul where they can no longer sustain the performance of being endlessly available to others. Jung observed that this awakening, while painful, is absolutely necessary. Without it, empaths remain trapped in unconscious patterns of self-sacrifice that slowly destroy them. The awakening is the moment empaths finally ask the question Jung believed was essential for psychological growth. Who am I without my usefulness to others? This question terrifies empaths because their entire identity has been built on being needed. But Jung insisted this terror must be faced. The false self constructed around people-pleasing and endless giving must die so the authentic self can emerge. The second stage Jung identified is what he called the withdrawal, the period where empaths pull back from relationships and situations that have been draining them. This isn't permanent isolation. Jung called it strategic retreat, for the purpose of psychological reorganization. During withdrawal, empaths finally have space to feel their own emotions without the interference of everyone else's psychological content. They begin to distinguish between authentic compassion and compulsive caretaking. They start recognizing patterns they've been unconsciously repeating for decades. Jung warned that this stage often triggers intense guilt in empaths. Everyone who has been benefiting from their endless availability will suddenly express concern, disappointment, or anger at the empath's new boundaries. Family members who relied on the empath's emotional labor will accuse them of being selfish. Friends who dominated conversations will complain the empath has changed. Partners who took more than they gave will insist the empath is becoming cold. Jung taught empaths to recognize these reactions for what they are, not legitimate concerns, but resistance from people who benefited from the empath's unconsciousness. True friends and healthy relationships will support the empath's growth. Toxic connections will reveal themselves through their anger at the empath's new boundaries. The third stage Jung termed integration of the shadow. For empaths, this means embracing qualities they've been taught are wrong or bad. Anger becomes righteous indignation that protects boundaries. Selfishness becomes healthy self-care that prevents depletion. Judgment becomes discernment that protects against manipulation. Jung insisted that empaths must reclaim these shadow qualities, not to become cruel, but to become whole. An empath who cannot access anger becomes a doormat. An empath who cannot be selectively selfish gives until they have nothing left. An empath who cannot judge character becomes prey for predators. Shadow integration doesn't make empaths less compassionate. It makes their compassion conscious and selective, rather than unconscious and indiscriminate. They learn what Jung called discrimination, the ability to choose who receives their gifts based on worthiness rather than need. The fourth stage is what Jung called the return, when empaths re-engage with the world, but from a fundamentally different psychological position. They no longer give from woundedness, hoping for validation. They give from wholeness as a conscious choice. Jung observed that empaths who complete individuation become what he termed the integrated wounded healer. They've been through suffering and emerged with wisdom, but they no longer identify with suffering or seek it out unconsciously. They can help others without losing themselves because they've developed what Jung called a relationship with the self that cannot be compromised by external demands. This integrated state is what Jung believed empaths were meant to achieve all along. The wound was never meant to destroy them. It was meant to initiate them into a higher level of consciousness. Jung identified specific qualities that distinguish empaths who have healed their wound from those still trapped in it. Healed empaths possess what Jung called conscious empathy. They can feel deeply without being overwhelmed. They sense others' emotions without absorbing them. They perceive psychological truth without taking responsibility for fixing everything they see. They've developed psychological sovereignty, what Jung described as being centered in your own truth while remaining open to others. They can love without losing themselves. They can give without depleting themselves. They can help without rescuing. Healed empaths also demonstrate what Jung termed selective engagement. They choose carefully who receives their emotional energy. They recognize that not everyone deserves access to their depth. They understand that boundaries aren't walls, but conscious choices about where to direct their gifts. Jung wrote that integrated empaths become dangerous to manipulation because they can see through it immediately and feel no guilt about withdrawing from toxic dynamics. They've learned that protecting themselves isn't selfishness but wisdom. Perhaps most importantly, healed empaths develop what Jung called authentic power. Not power over others, but power over themselves. They trust their perceptions absolutely because they've learned to distinguish between intuition and projection. They honor their needs without apologizing because they've integrated the reality that self-care isn't selfish. They live authentically even when it costs them relationships because they've discovered that freedom matters more than approval. Jung observed that this authentic power is actually what empaths possessed all along beneath their wounds. The sensitivity that seemed like weakness was actually strength waiting to be claimed. The clear seeing that got them labeled as problems was actually wisdom waiting to be honored. The deep feeling that exhausted them was actually extraordinary capacity waiting to be directed consciously. Jung's final insight about empaths and their wound reveals why this understanding matters not just individually, but collectively. He believed that empaths serve what he called an evolutionary function for human consciousness. They feel first what humanity will eventually need to process. They sense collective shadows before they become obvious. They carry consciousness that precedes cultural readiness. The empath's wound, Jung concluded, is actually humanity's wound being processed through particularly sensitive individuals. Empaths feel the disconnection, exploitation, and spiritual emptiness of modern life more acutely because their nervous systems are wired to detect these psychological realities. In traditional cultures, Jung noted, empaths would have been recognized as valuable precisely because of their sensitivity. They would have been trained as healers, seers, or wisdom keepers. Modern society, having lost these frameworks, treats empaths as problems to be fixed rather than gifts to be cultivated. But Jung believed this was changing. He predicted that as humanity evolved psychologically, empathic abilities would be increasingly recognized as advanced consciousness rather than pathology. He envisioned a future where children with empathic sensitivity would be identified early and taught how to develop their gifts consciously rather than being shamed for feeling too much. The wound of rare souls, Jung ultimately concluded, is the price of being born ahead of your time psychologically. Empaths carry consciousness that collective humanity hasn't yet developed. They feel connections that others deny. They sense truths that cultures work hard to ignore. This makes them lonely, exhausted, and often marginalized. But it also makes them essential for consciousness evolution. Every empath who heals their wound and integrates their gifts consciously makes it easier for the next generation of empaths to do the same. Every empath who learns to honor their sensitivity rather than apologize for it shifts collective understanding. Every empath who transforms their wound into wisdom demonstrates what's possible when rare souls claim their power. Jung spent his life studying human consciousness and psychological development. He worked with thousands of patients, representing every psychological type, but he reserved special respect for what he called the differentiated feeling types, the empaths who felt everything so deeply that they could barely function in ordinary society. He saw in them not weakness, but potential, not pathology, but evolution, not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be honored. Your experience of carrying more than others can understand isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. Your tendency to feel everything deeply isn't a disorder requiring medication into numbness. Your ability to sense what others miss isn't a problem needing correction. Jung would tell you these qualities mark you as what he called a rare soul, an individual born with consciousness that exceeds current collective development. The wound you carry is real. The exhaustion from absorbing everyone's emotions is legitimate. The loneliness of perceiving realities others deny is profound. But Jung discovered that this wound, when understood and integrated consciously, becomes the foundation for extraordinary psychological development and authentic power. You weren't meant to suffer endlessly. You were meant to transform your suffering into wisdom. You weren't meant to give until you're empty. You were meant to learn conscious generosity from fullness. You weren't meant to be everyone's emotional caretaker. You were meant to develop your own life while remaining connected to others through conscious choice rather than compulsive obligation. The wound of rare souls isn't a life sentence. It's an invitation to individuation, to becoming fully yourself in a world that pressures conformity. Jung's work provides the map. Your willingness to walk the path determines whether your wound destroys you or transforms you into exactly what this unconscious world needs most. Conscious empaths who know their worth, trust their perceptions, and refuse to dim their light for anyone's comfort. The time you've spent doubting yourself, questioning whether you're too sensitive, wondering why you feel so different from everyone else, all of that confusion ends when you understand Jung's revolutionary insight about empaths. You're not broken. You're not too much. You're not fundamentally flawed. You're a rare soul carrying a wound that marks you as psychologically advanced beyond current collective consciousness. That wound has isolated you, exhausted you, and nearly broken you precisely because you've been trying to function in a world that doesn't understand what you are. But when you stop trying to fit into frameworks designed for different psychological types and start honoring your unique consciousness, everything shifts. The sensitivity that seemed like a curse becomes your greatest strength. The clear seeing that got you labeled as negative becomes wisdom that guides you unerringly. The deep feeling that exhausted you becomes capacity for connection that others can only dream of experiencing. Jung believed empaths represented humanity's evolutionary potential. You feel now what collective consciousness will eventually need to integrate. You sense now what cultures will eventually need to acknowledge. You carry now what future generations will recognize as advanced psychological function rather than disorder. This means your suffering hasn't been meaningless. Every moment you've struggled to maintain boundaries in a world that exploited your porousness has been teaching you psychological sovereignty. Every relationship where you gave too much has been showing you the necessity of conscious choice. Every experience of being misunderstood has been preparing you to trust your own perceptions absolutely. The wound of rare souls doesn't heal by becoming less sensitive. It heals by becoming consciously sensitive. It heals by directing your gifts intentionally rather than scattering them unconsciously. It heals by recognizing that your empathic abilities aren't meant to serve everyone, but rather to serve those who can reciprocate depth with depth, authenticity with authenticity, consciousness with consciousness. When you comment below your truth about carrying what others cannot understand, you join a community of rare souls who recognize each other immediately. Write this exact truth in the comments right now, because naming your experience breaks the isolation that has been part of your wound. I carry what others cannot see, and I refuse to apologize for it anymore. Those words connect you to every empath reading this who has walked the same lonely path. Every person who writes that phrase creates permission for others to claim their truth. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. Your willingness to name what you've been taught to hide matters more than you realize. The subscription button below this video represents a choice to continue learning how to transform your empathic wound into conscious power. You've spent years consuming content that told you to toughen up, stop being so sensitive, get over it. This channel offers something different. Deep psychological understanding of why you are the way you are and how to honor that, rather than fight it. Click subscribe now because you deserve content that speaks to your actual experience rather than dismissing it. The like button represents recognition that this information resonates with truth you've always known but couldn't articulate. Press it now, because that simple action tells the algorithm to share this understanding with other empaths who desperately need to hear it. Every like extends the reach of this message to rare souls who believe they're alone in their experience. What I'm preparing for the next video will shake the foundations of everything you thought you understood about empathic gifts and their shadow side. Jung documented a phenomenon so disturbing about highly sensitive individuals that he hesitated to publish it during his lifetime. This discovery reveals why certain empaths become even more dangerous than the narcissists who targeted them, not through cruelty, but through a specific kind of psychological power that emerges when rare souls finally stop playing victim and start wielding their gifts consciously. You'll discover exactly what happens when the empath's wound transforms into something that manipulation cannot touch, when sensitivity becomes surgical precision, when the wounded healer completes their initiation and returns to the world as something entirely different. This isn't theory. This is Jung's clinical documentation of transformation he witnessed repeatedly but rarely discussed publicly because the implications threatened conventional understanding of power dynamics. The empaths who discover what I reveal in that next video never see themselves the same way again. They stop apologizing. They stop shrinking. They stop believing the lie that their sensitivity makes them weak. You've already started this journey by watching this video. The next one completes the initiation Jung mapped, but most empaths never discover. I'll see you there, in the next dimension of understanding what it truly means to be a rare soul who has finally claimed their power.